In this lecture, you will learn how to code a global exception handler for the purpose of customizing or modifying error response of REST APIs. In details, we will code a class that represents error details and code a class that handles generic exceptions and test error response for the REST APIs. Firstly, let's create a new class error detail that represents error details, and it has four fields: timestamp, status, path, and error. Okay, so come back to our IDE and create a new Java class here. Error detail. This class acts as a data transfer object, so you see the word detail. Okay, and we declare four fields. The first one is of type Java UT date, timestamp, and the second field is of type integer for status code, and the next field of type string for path, and the last field of type string for error. Very simple. And we generate getters and setters for the fields. Generate getters and setters. Select all. Generate. Okay. Reformat the code. Okay. So we see the code of the data transfer object class that represents error information. Next, let's code the global exception handler class and implement the method handle generic exception in order to catch all exceptions which can be thrown by the handler methods in all controller classes in the application, and this method will return an error detail object that represents error information. Before writing code, let me explain how a global exception handler works. So in this sequence diagram, you see the global exception handler class sits between API client and a REST controller, for example, location API controller. And let's see the first example. The API client sends a GET request to retrieve a list of locations to the API service application, and that means the list locations handler method in the location API controller class gets invoked, and if everything is going smoothly, the API returns HTTP status to our OK with the data to the API client. And in the second example, the API client sends a POST request to the API service in order to add a new location. So the add location handler method in the location API controller class gets invoked, and in this case, the handler method throws an exception. This exception is caught by the handle generic exception method in the global exception handler class, and after processing the exception handler class returns an error detail object to the controller, and in turn the controller the API returns HTTP status file internal server error to the API client with error details in the error detail object. Make sense? And you know, Spring Framework provides two kinds of exception handlers which you can choose to use. The first one is controller-based exception handler, and this is an example. You see we have a REST controller class here and regular handler methods for REST APIs and for handling exception, which can be thrown by the handler methods. Here we declare a new exception handler method like this right inside the controller class. Here you see this is exception handler method in a controller class, and we use three annotations: response body, exception handler, and response status. And in the next few minutes I will explain the purpose of these annotations. And the second kind of exception handler is called global exception handler, and this is an example. You see we create a separate class for handling all exceptions which can be thrown by all controllers in the application using the controller advised annotation. And in this class you can see there are three exception handler methods that handle three different types of exception. The first one handles multipath exception, and it returns status code bar request. And the second exception handler method handles HTTP request method not supported exception, and it returns the status method not allowed. And the third exception handling method handles IO exception class, and it returns the status code internal server error. And in this project we choose to use global exception handler, create only one exception handler class as a single component. Come back to the IDE, and before writing code for the exception handler class, let me start the Wiser API service application to test the add location API. Okay, the application is up and running, and I test the add location API using Postman here, and I specify value for location code like this, so it will not be able to pass the logic of the application because the maximum length of location code is just 12 characters. So I click send button here, and I see the error information in the response body here, internal server error, and I can see the full exception stack chase. Okay, now let's create a new Java class for customizing error response in REST APIs. Name the class as global exception handler, and we want to apply the exception handling methods in this class to all controllers in this application, so we use the controller advised annotation. Okay, and then we code only one exception handling method. This method returns an object of type error detail that represents error details. Handle generate exception. Okay, and the parameters of this method, we specify the request of type HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet request, and the exception is thrown by controller's exception, or just EX. Okay, and we need to use the exception handler annotation for the method here to specify the exact type of the exception that this method will catch, because we want to handle all generic exceptions. So we specify the exception type is exception class, which is a superclass of all exceptions in Java. And then we need to use the response status annotation to specify the status code of the error response to the API client. We use the status code internal server error, HTTP status internal server error. And the next annotation we need to use for the exception handling method is response body, to indicate that the method return value, the return value of this method will be bound directly to the web request. So in the method we process the request and exception and return a new object of type error detail that represents error details, customized error information. So we create a new error detail object here, return error object directory, and then we set the values for the fields timestamp, status, path, and error. We set timestamp is the current date and time. New date object from java.ut package, and we set the status code HTTP status internal server error value that returns an integer number of status code, and set error is a description of the HTTP status code. So we use HTTP status internal server error get reason phrase. Okay, and then we set the path of the request get servlet path. Okay, very simple. So when an exception is thrown by a handler method in a controller in the application, this method gets invoked and it returns an error detail object to the client that contains this information. Okay. Okay, now let me test the add location of API again. Okay, click send. And now you see a different response. You see we still got the status 500 internal server error, but the response body looks cleaner, right? With the values for timestamp, status, path, and error. Just a simple internal server error. And in the console view, you can see it prints a SQL error. The exact error is data truncation, data too long. So this sensitive information is hidden from the API client. And you can see the exception handler, exception resolver gets invoked to resolve the exception. You see, that means the global exception handler is working. It intercepts the exception thrown by the location API controller, the add location method here, and it returns a custom object of type error detail. And you can see the JSON document in the response body here. And we should log the exceptions thrown using a logger. As you can see, If I test the error response here, I can see the error information here, but in the console view, we don't see an exception stack chase here, so that's not good for developers, for programmers to debug the error, to fix the error. So that's why we should log the exception using a logger here. So I declare a logger. I use a logger class from SLF4j library. Logger equal logger factory. Get logger. We use a logger factory from SLF4j. Get logger. The log class is this class. Okay, and in case of exception, we log the exception object EX here. So it's very simple. Logger error message, and the exception object itself. Okay, and we test again. Clear the console. Okay, I test the add location API. I got a nice error response, customized error response. And in the console, as you can see, the exception is logged. You can see the logging class is global exception handler here. And the exception stack chase. So as API developers, I can debug the application to fix the error. But the real exception is not revealed to the API client, as you can see in the error response here. Alright, so far we have done customizing, modifying error response for REST APIs using global exception handler. Let me sum up the main points in this lecture. You know, Spring Framework uses AOP or aspect-oriented programming to intercept controllers handler methods for catching exceptions thrown by REST APIs. And we use some key annotations. Controller advice. This annotation applies AOP advices or actions globally for all controllers in the application. And we use the exception handler annotation that handles one or some specific types of exceptions. And we use a response body annotation to indicate a method return value should be bound to the web request body directory. And we use the response status annotation that sets a specific HTTP status code for the response. And you know that Spring Framework provides two kinds of exception handlers. The first one is exception handlers per controller or controller-based exception handling. And the second way in which we use in this project is global exception handler that is applied to all controllers in the application. And note that we should log the exceptions using a logger such as SLF4j or log4j.